Nice to be here to speak a bit about corruption and what the fossil fuel industry has to do with it. So I want to start with a question. Who of you thinks that the Austrian government is doing enough to halt climate breakdown? Who of you thinks they're doing enough? I see not a single hand go up. So basically, I can skip the rest of what I want to say because everybody is already aware of the problem. We see the effects of climate breakdown in our daily lives. Just think back, summer 2022, heat wave, drought, right in the middle of Europe. And it's getting only worse in the future. We're heading for dangerous climate tipping points. We're heading for a basically uninhabitable world of 3 degrees and more heating by 2100. So what does it mean? It means that billions of people will lose their homes because they can no longer live there. There's no longer any possibility to do agriculture there. So there's no food, there's also no water, and conditions become just unbearable for humans to live in. And why is that the case? Because we know where we're heading for 30 or 40 years. And what is the reason that governments are still choosing to ignore the problem? And here we get to the main topic of today, corruption. Let me start with a fictional example. Imagine there's a pharmaceutical company that markets a specific painkiller. This painkiller is quite popular, but the research shows that it's linked to cancer, and 10 to 20 years later, after people take this painkiller a lot, they get cancers. And what's adding to this, the company's own researchers have shown this, and they've shown this again and again and again. And instead of admitting that there's a problem and taking the product off the market or trying to find a way to make it safer, the company hires lawyers, the company hires public relations specialists, the company fires its own scientists and tries to convince the public that there's no problem at all. And sales of this painkiller continue for years and years and years until finally public prosecutors get behind what's going on and take it off the market, and hopefully impose a harsh fine on said company. The very same thing is happening with fossil fuels. As the UN Secretary General said, fossil fuels, to fossil fuel companies, your core product is our core problem. Scientists have shown for decades that fossil fuels are behind global heating, are behind the climate crisis. The fossil fuel companies own scientists. They had science departments back in the 1970s, 1980s, did a lot of climate change research, and it kind of never got published, but it found its way into the memos of the oil executives. And we have a paper trail leading back to the 1970s and 1980s of how the big oil companies like Shell or like Exxon were all aware of what was happening and were all publicly denying what their own scientists said. But other than in my fictional example of this painkiller causing cancer, it's not affecting single people, it's affecting humanity as a whole, and it's affecting the entire biosphere of the Earth. So why are politicians not able to tackle this problem? Because when I asked very first question, nobody said governments have this in any way under control. And the reason is also corruption. Fossil fuel companies pay a lot in basically bribes. there's hundreds of millions of dollars spent every year by the biggest oil companies on climate lobbying, which is meant to delay, disrupt, or even stop any climate change legislation that would have a meaningful impact. And fossil fuel companies are also trying to influence the minds of every citizen by enormous spending on advertising. And there are multiple axes of attack by the fossil fuel industry. And one of them is to try to convince people that emissions are their problem and not the companies. It is telling that the ecological footprint I think we all know about was invented by BP, which is an oil company. Because they want people to worry about their own emissions instead of what is driving society to produce more and more oil and gas. And people might worry about their own impact on the environment, and they might still find that they can do little if they don't want to wait for hours to get to work in the morning. So they still stop at the BP gas station and fill up their car because they have no other choice, but with a bad conscience, which doesn't hurt the company's profits at all. And by pretending it was an individual responsibility, politicians get around doing what should be done. They get around passing effective legislation that finally stops fossil fuel companies from pushing their deadly product to people. And we tried many things over the past decades. So one of the first things that happened was scientific warnings. There are enough scientific warnings to fill books with. 1992, 1 year after I was born, the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, which explicitly included a reference that we should phase out fossil fuels. What has happened? Emissions have only gone up and up and up since then. Also, we have seen mass protests. Fridays for Future movement has been on the streets for 4 years in a row, and nothing has changed. Politicians are still unable to pass even the most menial of restrictions on fossil fuel use. And this is the environment in which the letzte Generation, last generation, was founded, because we saw that whatever the climate movement has been doing was not enough. And I want to show you something. Hope I can draw this in the early morning. So the UN Secretary General used a quite figurative example. He said that we're on the highway to climate hell, we're foot still on the accelerator. So we're on a road that is basically leading to a cliff. And this car is basically at full speed ahead to the cliff. And if this car goes over the cliff, it falls down 100 meters, 200 meters, any distance you can imagine. That is basically impossible to survive. So what has to be done to stop this car from going over the cliff before it is too late? Is it enough to stop the car at point 1, that is 50 meters behind the cliff? It won't help. It will still fall down. Is it enough to stop the car at point 2, which is 2 meters behind the cliff? It will also not help. And the interesting thing is that point 2 is no better than point 1. So the only sensible way is to stop the car at point 3, which is just ahead of the cliff. But how do we get there? And what do these points actually stand for? Point 1 stands for what scientists have been doing for decades, issuing warning after warning after warning, publishing IPCC reports that governments just choose not to listen to. Point 2 is public demonstrations, petitions, all these kinds of things that people can legally do in our democracy to show that they do not agree, but it can be easily ignored because they do not disrupt everyday life. And point 3 is what we are trying to do. As letzte Generation, last generation, we're trying to cause so much disruption in a peaceful, non-violent way that people are forced to think about the problem, and that people are no longer able to bury their heads in the sand and pretend the problem just wasn't there. And as in a real car, the economy doesn't change course from one day to the next. This car goes some distance, even if you hit the brakes very hard before it comes to a halt. And the same for our economy. So if we want to make sure that we can actually stop here, we have to hit the brakes hard, and we have to hit the brakes now. Because even 1 or 2 years later, it could be too late. And that has something to do with climate tipping points. One of the easiest to explain tipping points is the Arctic ice. If the ice goes away, there's the sea below it, there's the rocks beneath it, and basically everything that's beneath the ice has less albedo than the ice itself. That means the ice reflects a lot of sunlight back to space. This is energy that doesn't arrive on Earth. When the ice is gone, much more of this energy is actually absorbed by seawater, by rocks, so it gets warmer. And if it gets warmer, more ice melts. You can see a vicious circle that's leading to a growing reduction in sea ice, which is in turn leading to more and more warming. And there are several of these tipping points, and they're also interconnected, as the science shows. And we do not know where the point is when this cascade of dominoes goes off. So the safest way is to stop as early as possible. And how can we achieve this? When everything else has failed, when fossil fuel corruption has basically taken over our governments. It's completely useless to tell politicians the science and expect them to act on it, because they already know. And if they still don't know, after decades of campaigning, after 4 years of basically continuous climate protests, then they will never understand. And we still have a chancellor that recently gave a speech where he basically denied climate science. So my question is this guy too dumb to understand what the science is saying, or is this guy too corrupt to act on what he knows? So what letzte Generation, last generation is doing is basically we organize a civil disobedience campaign, a campaign of mass civil resistance. Civil resistance has a long tradition. Whenever a society is in a deep moral crisis that cannot be addressed by other means. One example of a very successful civil disobedience campaign was the civil rights movement in the US. And of course, conditions today are different, the people are different, and so on, but we can still take inspiration from these past campaigns, just as, for example, the civil rights movement itself took inspiration from the Indian independence movement around Gandhi. And there are a couple components for successful civil resistance. And it all boils down to 3. One is disruption. So you create public disruption to an extent that cannot be ignored. The second is sacrifice. People who disrupt are willing to take personal sacrifices, are willing to go to jail, are willing to face fines, and so on. And the third component is escalation, that if demands are not listened to, the disruption will only get worse. And we are trying to do just that. So the typical protest of Letzte Generation consists of a couple people wearing orange vests, unfolding banners, and blocking any major road. So we never disrupt flowing traffic, because that would be dangerous to do. We get on crosswalks when we're allowed to do, and we just stay there. So the cars are already stopped, but we just don't leave. We instead put on our orange vests, we unfold our banners, and we wait until police decides to remove us. Most of the time, some people also use super glue, because in our experience, if you don't glue yourself to the road, it's over in 15 minutes. If you use super glue, you stay there for 30 minutes, for 45 minutes, so the disruption gets a lot worse. And it's already unignorable. Politicians can't just say, oh, there's no problem at all, let them have their march and then continue ignoring them. We are taking headlines, and our civil disruption was also talked about in Parliament. So it seems we are reaching the right people. And what do we demand? We demand that the simplest, easiest things to fight climate breakdown are done, which is lowering the speed limit to 100 kilometers an hour on highways, which would, on its own, prevent the emission of almost 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide every year at no cost, and at most likely even a slight benefit to the economy, as the Umweltbundesamt shows. And the second demand is to halt all new oil and gas drilling, because oil and gas is literally killing us, and the Austrian government is still allowing new oil projects, new gas projects to go ahead, which is just insanity in times like this, when the climate breakdown is already hitting our society, hitting our economy, and of course hitting humanity as a whole. And if our civil disruption campaign works, and the government actually agrees to these demands, we have shown that we can actually get something done, which is what the Fridays for Future movement has failed to do for more than 4 years, despite countless negotiations with politicians who just refuse to listen. And if the government doesn't even agree to these minimal demands, we have shown once and for all that this government is too corrupt to lift a finger to save our very lives, which means that more and more people will see a reason to get into serious civil disobedience, get into serious civil resistance, because nothing else can stop this government from genociding half of humanity. Because that's what we are facing. We are facing a threat to civilization itself. We are facing a threat to humanity's very existence, because we are wiping out the conditions that enabled humanity to get to the point we're at. A stable climate, stable agriculture, and we're destroying all of that. And this is the main reason Letzte Generation engages in civil resistance that just cannot be ignored.